Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Township of Mapleton Council meeting for Tuesday, September 10th, 2024. Please rise if you're able for O Canada. Is there any declaration of pecuniary interest? Seeing none. Item number 4.1, moved by Councillor Ottens, seconded by Councillor Tamlin, that the minutes of the Township of Mapleton Council meeting held on August 13, 2024 be confirmed as circulated in the agenda. Questions or comments? All in favor? It's carried. Moving on to items under the Planning Act. This is a public meeting under the Planning Act to hear comments from the public and agencies and to give consideration to application ZBA 2024-12 for proposed zoning bylaw amendment. Subject lands are located at Part Lot 13, Concession 10, 7516 Wellington Road 8. Purpose and effect is to rezone the portion of the property currently occupied by the church building to a residential zone. The applicants are proposing to renovate the church into a residential duplex. The existing cemetery on the lands would remain institutional zoning. Mr. Clerk, statutory requirements.
Thank you, sir. Staff can confirm that property owners, Mapleton staff, and agencies were provided with required notice on August 21st. Proper site postings concluded on August 22nd, and County of Wellington planner comments are in the agenda package.
Thank you, Mr. Clerk. And Linda Redmond. Your comments, please.
Thank you, Mayor. So this zone amendment is to rezone the lands that are known as the Goldstone Church. The church had become redundant to the United Church, I think it was, and they sold the land off. So the applicants purchased it with the intention of converting the church building into residential. And through that process, they did meet with the FBCSA, which is, I'm just looking it up. I'm saying it wrong, aren't I, Michelle? I'll let Michelle talk about that. But they did go through the channels to close the cemetery. They also were required to do an inventory of the property to ensure that the area that they're going to use for the residential does not contain any graves or any remains. So it's taken quite a while to get to this point with them, so we're happy they're here. At this point in time, they would like to convert the building into 2 residential units. We have no concerns with that, provided they have enough area or they can provide adequate servicing to the property. It is located in the rural area, so it'll be on septic. The proposal will also require them to maintain the cemetery that is there in an institutional, we'll leave it in an institutional zone so that it protects the cemetery, and there is access still maintained to the cemetery for public access for visitors that would like to go to the cemetery. So that, as you can see in the mapping in Figure 1, that area that's labeled as cemetery area and the access will remain an institutional zone or site-specific zone to allow strictly the cemetery. We have to discuss that still. And then the remaining land will be put into a residential zone to allow or an agricultural zone with a residential site specific to allow the 2 units. We have no concerns with this application. It's a great reuse of an existing historical building in the township, and we're happy to see it finally making some progress.
Perfect. And are you Darcy? Do you have any comments or anything to say there, Darcy? Thank you. Other comments from those in attendance? Since we only have Darcy and his wife, I guess nobody else is here to make comments. Questions from council members then, to the applicant or to the planner? Councilor Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have more of a personal interest question, actually, not really related to your. So in a case of an application like this, where an entire property is purchased that includes a cemetery, I'm assuming that the property that's severed off or designated as a cemetery, like there's no property taxes are taxed on that piece of property, correct? And that maintenance and upkeep, who looks after that in the case of a kind of historic cemetery?
I think Patrick wants to answer that question, but just for clarification, the cemetery is going to remain in the same ownership as the house property. That's still one property, and the landowner is obligated to maintain it. It's just the zoning that will differentiate the uses.
Did you have any comments
The
there,
tax
Patrick?
question,
You
though,
good?
I don't.
Okay. Vote taxes.
Yeah, through you, Mayor Davidson. So the property, it's the land portion of the property that would be considered cemetery land and deemed exempt from that portion. It should be based on, I don't have the exact roll number and assessment information. It should be. The key piece with assessment is always going to be the building itself and the structure that's going to drive the assessment. So I wouldn't see any significant implications.
Thank you. Anybody else? This public meeting is now concluded. I do have a resolution here, moved by Councillor Tamlin, second by Councillor Ottens. Township of Mapleton Council received for information the planning report regarding ZBA 2024-12 Goldstone Church, Part Lot 13, Concession 10, 7516 Wellington Road 8. All in favor? That's carried. We have no delegations tonight. Move into item 9.1, and this is going to be moved by Councillor Otten, second by Councillor Tamlin. The Township of Mapleton Council received for information bylaw report BL 2024-01 municipal parking and signage, and that council does not consider any changes to the current 2-hour parking bylaw time limit, and further that council supports staff expanding parking signage in the villages, promoting the location of the municipal parking lots to be installed no later than May 31st, 2025. Rick, do you have any, you want to talk about your report?
So the parking report for downtown, essentially what we've done with our research is we've looked at what the theater is currently providing for parking solutions, including a map as to where people that are attending can find parking in our community. The concern with the 2-hour limit and changing it up in certain areas is that if we have a lot of stores or restaurants requesting for these changes, it might be difficult to change a lot of locations and signage instead of having a standard 2-hour, which most downtowns in the area have. However, if something like that is required in certain areas, that can be done, and that's as simple as putting up new signage and changing the schedule in the parking bylaw, and that just requires a report to council to do so. One thing I did find out is that currently our schedule is empty in our parking bylaw, so the 2-hour downtown parking limits are currently not enforceable. because we got a new parking bylaw just at the end of 2023. So the schedule still has to be updated on that. Further than that, we looked into general signage in the downtown area and seeing if certain updates are required to make it more noticeable for people, to direct people towards our free parking, as well as making sure that our 2-hour signage is in the appropriate location, as well as some of our handicap spots and accessibility spots. Some of the signage there need to be updated as well, because we're not marking some of the appropriate areas for the parking there. So that's essentially what we've looked into so far with our report. When it comes to any type of like drop or pickup areas or customer-only parking or things like that, unfortunately, on public property, we can't make any signage that doesn't fall within our bylaws. So in this case, if something like that, if you want to put something like that in place, you would have to amend our current parking bylaw to allow for such signage to be put in place. And that's not something that, unfortunately, a time limit is the only thing we can do at this time for an update.
Thanks, Rick. Questions then on this report to Rick? Councillor Ottens?
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Yeah, I notice with the theater people, especially if they're new to town, probably like anyone, you come to town, the first thing you do is find the theater, and then you find parking. But if you come into town and find the theater, there's probably no way to know there's a giant parking lot on the other side of that building, so probably a sign or something there. But I also wondered about the big early years and bank parking. I know those are private property, but it specifically says parking for bank customers only, but we all know the bank doesn't need them evenings, weekends. Like, is there something we could do about that? And I don't know what hours the early years runs either, so that might help keep people away from parking on the streets in front of people's homes, which I think is the big issue here.
Through you, Mayor. Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to these private property parking lots, that is something we can enforce with the permission of those from the landlord. They could sign a form with us and we can enforce their parking restrictions on their property. That is something we can discuss with the landowners of those properties and seeing if they are interested or willing to work with the theater to offer that parking outside of their business hours. And like you said, yeah, when people come to town to look for the theater, how many people do their research online to make sure they get the appropriate parking spot? Most people, I'm assuming, type in Drayton Theater and start driving here. So signage at the theater is something we have to kind of look into. What is the best placement for us to put the signage for that free parking lot when they do arrive here at the theater? Because if we put them inside the theater, it's going to be too late. They've already parked when they walk in. I don't think a lot of people are going to walk back out to move. Some might, but so that's something that we can discuss with some of our business owners to try and see if they're willing to have some signage or direction towards their parking lots as well, if they're willing to offer up some of the parking in the evenings when business hours aren't accessible. But the current issue we have is that the enforcement of most of the parking is shared between OPP and myself. And in the evenings, we would have to schedule a time for enforcement to be available because outside of regular business hours, the enforcement is limited.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate the report and thank you for the collaboration that took place to come to this report. I do like the idea of additional signage downtown. I know that something we discussed before. People can't find the parking lot if they're new to coming to the community. So having the proper signage that is visible at every intersection that's down there would be very helpful. I know that from talking to some people that volunteer at the theater, they often get people walking in the front door going, where can I park? Because they right outside the theater come in, where can I park? And even they don't always know that there's the parking lot. So having those people there as well to be able to direct them to the parking lot would be helpful. But thank you very much. Other questions, comments? Seeing none, all in favor? It's carried. Item 9.1.2, moved by Councillor Tammons, second by Councillor Ottens, that the Township Mapleton Council receive for information Building Department Report BD 2024-11, dated September 10th, 2024, regarding August month-end and year-to-date building activity. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you, Mayor Davidson. To Mayor Davidson and Council, the Building Department is pleased to present the August month-end report for information. As shown on the attachment, during the month of August, we issued a total of 28 building permits with a construction value of $2,880,000. Issued building permits for the year came to a total of $35,840,000. For the month of August, this report shows we are below the 3-year average fees collected due to the type of building permits issued. In the year of 2021, having a higher than usual number of issued permits as well. The month of August also shows a lower than average construction value compared to the previous 3 years. This can be associated with lower construction material costs when compared to pandemic prices. So far, the month of September, building permit applications appear to be picking up as builders are preparing to have foundations poured prior to cold weather. Does council have any questions associated with the August month-end building report?
Questions?
Okay.
Seeing none.
Thank you.
Tim. All in favor of receiving? It's carried. Next up is the asset management plan. Is it a tag team in this, or we're doing this? Yeah, okay. Go ahead, DK.
All right, thank you, Mayor Davidson. Over the past several years, municipalities across the province have developed asset management plans and programs in accordance with provincial legislation. Here in Mapleton Township, however, through continued investments in building asset management capacity, investments in a dedicated staffing position, we've went well beyond the requirements of OREG 588-17 and worked towards building a holistic culture of asset management. The following presentation is representative of a culmination of work and dedication from internal staff across multiple service areas under the leadership and guidance of Mapleton's in-house asset management expert, Amanpreet Bains, and prior work from my predecessor, Mr. John Morrison. Prior to handing the presentation over to Ms. Bains, we wanted to share a short video that was developed by the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. This video underscores the critical importance of infrastructure asset management in ensuring the long-term sustainability of our community. So, Maggie, if you can start that video.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and members of council. Thank you for having me today. Today I'm here to present the 2024 asset management plan for our non-core assets. This includes our facilities, outdoor recreation and land improvements, fire services, and fleet and machinery assets. This presentation will cover why asset management is important, what is the current state of our infrastructure for non-core assets, and how do we plan to address the funding gap to maintain the current levels of service. Our goal is to ensure that our infrastructure continues to serve the residents reliably and sustainably into the future, all the while aligning with provincial regulations. First of all, let's take a moment to think about all the services in our community that we rely on the most, whether it's clean water, safe roads, emergency response, or recreation, and ask ourselves, what infrastructure makes that service possible? Clean water depends on our water treatment plants and distribution systems. Safe roads rely on proper maintenance, snowplows, repairs, and resurfacing. Emergency responses require well-equipped fire halts, reliable fire trucks, and accessible road network. And recreation depends on well-maintained parks, facilities, and safe playgrounds. So essentially, assets provide services that contribute to our quality of life. Thanks. What is asset management? Asset management is a systematic process of developing, operating and maintaining, upgrading, and if needed, disposing the assets in a manner that is most cost-effective. It isn't just about innovation or creating new assets. It's about anticipating and addressing whatever challenges that comes with it. Just like the excitement of the world's first wheel was soon followed by the first pothole, every acquisition of asset comes with its own maintenance and operation activities. Balancing those performance, costs, and risks over the entire life cycle of an asset helps us maximize the value and ensure that it continues to meet the needs that it was designed for. We've talked about what is asset management, but why asset management? In the recent years, we've all seen the headlines about major infrastructure failures across different municipalities. They serve as a stark reminder of what happens if our assets are not managed efficiently. Examples include the major water main break in Calgary, the water main break in Montreal that caused that massive flooding, forever closure of the Ontario Science Centre because of its poor roof condition, and the region of Waterloo residents being asked to conserve water as they repair a pipe that supplies 20% of the region's water, and many more. Strong asset management practices helps us avoid surprises like infrastructure failures, emergency repairs, and interruption to service. Asset management is about future-proofing of our community's infrastructure. This graphic really summarizes of what the building blocks of asset management are. We need to know, what do we own? Where is it? What is it worth? What condition is it in? What needs to be done? And when it needs to be done by. Ultimately, the goal of asset management is to ensure that our municipalities' assets are managed efficiently and are operating effectively, which helps us reduce the cost and extends the life cycle. It is a holistic approach that takes into account the diverse needs of our community, recognizing that assets should serve everyone equitably and contribute to a sense of belonging and unity. Thanks. We might ask ourselves, haven't we been doing this all along? Well, traditionally, managing assets focused more on day-to-day activities of specific assets. It was relatively short-term, addressed the immediate concerns, and involved routine decisions like maintenance and repairs. Versus asset management takes a more holistic approach. It considers the entire asset portfolio as long-term, aims for the sustained value and future planning. It requires strategic decisions and consider the entire life cycle. It is a continuous rebalance of priorities between performance, which is measured through levels of service, risk, which is how likely an asset is to fail, and what is the impact on our community, and the financial cost of it. Asset management as a process in the township is a detailed understanding of the assets, including their life cycle cost, condition, risk, performance. And by integrating this data within our budgeting process, we can continue to prioritize projects and ensure that resources are allocated to where they're needed the most and when they're needed the most. Council plays a crucial role in asset management by setting the strategic direction, defining levels of service, and committing to the resources. Council's leadership ensures alignment between the goals of community and the asset management strategies. Ontario Regulation 588-17 outlines a multi-year plan for implementing asset management principles and strategies. The latest milestone requires all municipalities to have an asset management plan for all its assets and current levels of service by 2024. Our 2022 plan included all the core assets, which are roads, bridges, culverts, stormwater network, water, and wastewater infrastructure. This plan expands to include the non-core assets, again, facilities, outdoor recreation, fire services, and fleet and machinery. This plan will bring us in compliance with those regulatory requirements. This asset management plan also follows the similar structure as the 2022 plan. It has a state of infrastructure, which is our inventory and what the condition of the assets is like, levels of service, which measures the performance, community versus technical, all the different life cycle management strategies that help us extend the life cycle, the risk and criticality of the assets, and finally, the financial strategy. The state of infrastructure. This summarizes what overall our assets are looking like. For non-core, our total replacement cost is at $77.6 million, of which facilities are a huge chunk at $56 million, followed by fire services at 10, fleet and machinery at 8, and then outdoor recreation and land improvement at $3 million. 63% of our assets are in fair or better condition, 23% are poor, and 14% are very poor. We are at an annual capital infrastructure deficit of $744,000. Next slide, please. This slide shows all the asset analysis by every category. In the table, we can see the average estimated useful life of our assets, what is the average age in 2023, and the service life remaining in 2023. The graph on our left shows the average annual requirement by category for all the assets over the next 10 years. We do see that facilities contribute a lot. We see a spike in 2028. That's due to a lot of work being needed by PMD Arena as the facility ages. A spike for fire services in 2027. That's to pumper trucks needing replacement. The graph on our right shows the asset condition by category, and it shows like what percentage of our assets for all the categories are very good, good, fair, poor, or very poor. Next slide, please. This is what we call an infrastructure report card to basically show how we are doing in all our assets. It shows the replacement cost, average asset condition, and the financial capacity, which means how much money is needed annually, what is the funding available, and finally, the annual deficit. Overall, we are right in the middle, fair, 50%. Our annual requirement is $2.5 million. We're already funding $1.8 million and a deficit of $744,000. Next slide. In the plan, you would also see levels of service, which measures our performance. It is community versus technical. Community is how people see the services being provided, and technical is how the township provides that services. We basically measure scope, capacity or availability, reliability of those assets, what's the condition, and if they are safe for use for the residents. Next slide, please. Life cycle management strategies are the key activities that help us take a proactive approach when it comes to managing our assets and that help us extend the useful life. These are non-infrastructure solutions, which are all the condition assessments that we do, any master plans, operation and maintenance activities, which are very asset-specific, renewals, rehab or replacements, disposals if needed, service improvements, and growth. This is the risk formula that we all know by now. It's a simple multiplication of probability of failure, how likely is an asset to fail, and the consequence of failure, which is the impact on our community. The only colors that we need to worry about are red and orange. Red, very high risk, about $12 million worth of assets, and orange, the high-risk assets, which are at about $27 million. Next slide, please. Financial strategy. It looks at the annual capital requirements for each of our asset categories. For instance, facilities alone require $1.1 million per year, but our funding currently is inefficient. Addressing the gap is vital, so that we ensure that we are maintaining our current levels of service, and it is recommended that annual tax levy be increased by 1.47% each year over the next 5 years, solely for the purpose of phasing in full funding of the township's existing known core assets and infrastructure at the existing service levels. Next slide. Again, our short-term targets are compliance with Ontario Regulation 588-17, developing and refining our asset management procedures and processes, full integration of risk assessment with the levels of service, and as well integrating data from various studies, reports, and systems. Our long-term targets include developing a funding strategy, continuous maturation of our asset data, integration of township strategic planning and master planning, and public engagement strategy. Next slide. And finally, we recognize that asset management is a journey that requires continuous improvement and updates. And thank you.
Thanks, Aman. So prior to opening up for questions from council, just want to quickly underscore the value of us building this holistic culture of asset management and the importance of continuing the township's investment in building our asset management capacity. It allows our team here to provide information to council and to the community that supports evidence-based decision-making, that ensures we make the right investment into the right asset at the right time. It underpins our strategic pillar of diligent fiscal management, and the recommended financial strategy within this report will help ensure appropriate funds are in place moving forward. With the support of council, we can ensure a fiscally sustainable municipality with quality infrastructure for future generations. And prior to handing it over now, I feel it's appropriate to go a bit off script, and I've been part of 6 or 7 asset management plans now in my career. I can honestly say without a doubt, I have never seen that level of passion, enthusiasm, and expertise in a presentation on asset management. The report before you speaks for itself. That I was well aware of. I did not know how much to expect from Aman and was blown away tonight. So we do truly have a great human resource asset in our asset management and procurement manager, and should be grateful for that. So I'll hand it back to you for any questions from council.
Thank you, Patrick. We do agree with you there. Thank you, Aman, for your presentation. Certainly laid out the information that we need as council to understand where we're at with non-core. And when you tie that in with our core assets, the picture is quite bleak when it comes to how far we're behind. Because if I remember correctly, it's just under $10 million for the core assets that we're short yearly, and that's quite a bit of money. And you're asking this increase by 1.47% each year over 5 years just for these non-core assets, and then to top that with the core asset issue, and we're topping up quite a bit. Council, questions? It was quite the report. Manny and I have briefly discussed parts of the report. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the whole report. Councilor Martin.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I would agree, Baines, great job on that presentation. I thought you were going to be like an hour getting through that thing, and it was like bam, 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 getting right through it. So the FCM video at the top was fantastic. I swear John Morrison was the executive producer of that thing. I think the only way we could have improved that was if we could have done a voiceover with him, including his financial pillars. And I'm really not mocking, it's great that we're doing this exercise. Like when Marlene and I've said this before, but when we started in 2014, we were still doing like year-over-year budgets, right? 1 year capital, 1 year operating. So to actually see all of our assets, defined, which was a big deal, and I'm sure a lot of work, right? I know, we didn't even know all the assets that we had, right? Whether it's land, right, that we found, or not found, looked for and documented, so it's, I think it's fantastic, and it's really going to be what we do with this information now that is going to be the tricky part, right? Because we're not alone, right? Every municipality in Ontario, arguably, is going to have this exact conversation. But I think it's a really transparent exercise that we can do for our ratepayers, so they know what we're up against as well, right? I enjoyed most of what you had in the presentation outside of that dedicated infrastructure levy, but I do understand the concept on why you would propose something like that, right? Because, you see the deficit and it speaks for itself. The one question, I understand how, in a way, how we got to the ratings of poor, good, very poor. And when we look at fleet and fire services, for example, I forget, their ratings are relatively low, I think. It's obviously not just vehicles, it would be equipment and overall replacement costs, I assume, that would get inputted into that formula. I know it hasn't been recently in the last year or two, but I know our Public Works fleet, for example, is always, locally, I think Mapleton has a good reputation for having a good fleet, right? It's not run down, and I know the one comment I got about was you guys are always driving new snow plows and blah, 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 and I'm like, well, don't cry, apply, right? If you like it, come and join us. But how do we get to a point, obviously it's not just the look of the trucks, but what all goes into, say, the fleet, for example, of our Public Works?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Councillor Martin, for your question. We do see, in our recommendations, recommendation for a fleet master plan for 2025. A lot of our fleet is currently age-based, which might not necessarily be the best way to decide the condition of our assets. So like you mentioned, asset management is a journey, it's a continuous improvement. So as we do our condition assessments, we will improve upon all our data sets and see what actually is in a bad condition and needs current replacement, and what's doing good and we might get a couple of years out of it. So it's a continuous process. Hopefully by 2025, we'll have a fleet master plan in place, and we'll be able to give you a more accurate picture of what our condition actually is like. But yeah, so right now it's mostly age-based. So we hope to improve our data as well as our fleet as we go.
Well, we look forward to that report coming out for 2025, because absolutely right now, and we're not the only ones that do age-based. A lot of municipalities do age-based. But certainly, as Councillor Martin pointed out, a lot of our equipment looks fantastic, especially our works equipment looks fantastic regardless of the age. The only part of that twist is how much money can you get for the return. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you. Great response, Aman. I guess I would just add on top of that, we did have preliminary budget discussions with the fire services management team today. Very confident that through that fleet management strategy, there will be a significant amount of additional data going into that process, hearing back from the chief and, sorry, job title, Khalees, today in our meeting. A great deal of work is going into understanding the inventory of what's in place there, understanding better the condition. All of that information goes into our asset management program. Data, I referenced it a couple times and Amon did, data is the most critical piece of this whole process. And I think the decision-making that this council made, forward-thinking decision-making of moving into this fire services model has expanded the ability to gather that data, and it's much more reliable and will support that plan. So great question, Councillor.
Let's go to do the resolution here for the first part, because Amon's got a second part to this. So the first part is moved by Councillor Otten, second by Councillor Tamlin, that Township Mapleton Council receive for information the presentation slideshow AMP 2024 dated September 4th, 2024, as submitted by Asset Procurement Manager Amon Bains. We'll vote on this, and then we'll get into the next section, and we'll have another resolution. So all in favor? Okay, we're carried. Amon, you want to do section 2? Do you have another report now? Or is that all part of one?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It was all actually a part of one.
All right. Then the second resolution I have here is moved by Councillor Tamlin, second by Councillor Ottens, that the Township Mapleton Council receive for information Finance Report FIN 2024-20, dated September 20th, 2024, regarding the Asset Management Plan non-core assets, and that Township Mapleton Council approved the 2024 Asset Management Plan non-core assets. So any further questions then from council then? Councillor Ottens?
Yes, thank you, through you, Mayor. Since this is an Ontario regulation, has there been any noise or rumblings at the provincial level of any kind of funding, given that the deadline is 2025, for something coming our way to help with this?
Patrick?
Sure, I'll give a first response and then Amon can add on. Short answer is no. The province of Ontario, though this legislation is in place and a requirement for us to meet, I think the idea behind the legislation was for the province to have a more accurate understanding of how deep the infrastructure deficit is in municipalities, rather than anecdotally municipalities coming with hands open to the province saying we need funding. This work, meeting these regulatory deadlines and producing plans of this quality in particular, should only serve to support us in future requests for infrastructure funding. We can go back to the previous meeting discussions on the social and economic prosperity review. A deep review needs to happen between the provincial and municipal funding framework. We know as staff as well as council that the formula currently isn't working. We own the vast majority of infrastructure, but have the smallest access to funding for it. So appreciate the work that yourselves as council and the mayor can do in advocating to our provincial peers for the need for stable, reliable, and predictable infrastructure funding. But again, nothing clear saying there will be more infrastructure funding, but this should serve to help us out.
Anything further to add to that? And I know from previous conversations, as Patrick had pointed out, funding is going to be tied to your asset management plan. So future funding. No funding to do it, but future funding relies on the asset management plan being done and what it states. Councillor Reid.
Through you, Mayor. I'm just wondering, we're talking in here, I know the recommendation isn't, excuse me, approving any budgetary changes at all. This will all come through in our budget meetings later this year.
That's correct. Any further questions or comments? All right, thank you. I read the recommended resolution. All in favor? It's carried. Moving on to 9.2.2. This is Development Charges Bylaw Amendment. Patrick?
Thank you, Mayor Davidson. This report's a follow-up to a previous report that was referred back to staff for additional information and consideration at this evening's meeting. The report outlines that subsequent to the township's DC background study and rate schedule, an additional $450,000 in growth-related capital funding was identified for services related to a highway. As I outlined and mentioned earlier this evening, the Social and Economic Prosperity Review notes that municipalities have limited options to fund critical infrastructure. As such, staff would continue to recommend that these costs be incorporated within the updated DC rate schedule as presented to ensure that wherever and whenever possible, we have growth paying for growth. Alternatively, assuming that there are no external funding options available, the funding would need to be derived from the general tax levy. The net impact, if included within the DC rates, is approximately $590 of additional development charges for a single or semi-detached dwelling. If approved, these rates would come into force and effect on any future developments, and if denied, the additional $450,000 would be incorporated within the upcoming municipal budget and reflected within our updated tax levy bylaw. I would add that the ultimate outlay of these funds, the $450,000, if it were deemed unnecessary down the road or wouldn't need to happen, those funds don't disappear. They would end up being a credit within the next DC calculation and reduce the total DC charge applicable for future developments. So ultimately, if we do need to outlay the funds, growth would pay for it. If we don't need to, the funds collected would go towards other growth-related initiatives down the road. Happy to take any questions from council.
Thank you. The resolution here is moved by Councillor Otten, seconded by Councillor Tamlin, that Township Mapleton Council receive for information Finance Report FIN 2024-21 regarding the Development Charges Bylaw Amendment. Questions from members of council then? Call again. Questions from members of council? Seeing none. All in favor? That's carried. Next up, we have the Housing Accelerator Fund 2.0. Patrick?
Thank you once again, Mayor Davidson. This is a fairly short report that outlines a great deal of work that has occurred to prepare the proposed application under Intake 2 of the Housing Accelerator Fund, better known as HAF 2.0. As noted within the report, we were unsuccessful in our application under the first intake, and on July 8th of this year, the federal government announced a second intake. Funding's only available, underscore that, only available to applicants who applied during the first round of the HAF funding, so a smaller list, obviously, of participants this go around. A cross-functional staff team have been working diligently with the support of a team of consultants from Colliers to review and update our existing application. The report outlines two key items for consideration under this intake. One was the continued classification of Mapleton as a large urban center, and the requirement to allow for 4 units per residential lot as of right to support infill development in low-density neighborhoods. As of right zoning, it explains in the report, also known as pre-zoning, is intended to improve the predictability and shorten timelines for approvals by removing the need for rezoning applications. As the report outlines, we continue to contend that we should not and never ever should be considered to be a large urban center. However, the parameters established by the Treasury Board include a municipality with a population over $10,000 being deemed as a large urban center. Also based on feedback from program administrators and consultants from Colliers, it was determined that 4 units as of right would be retained within the application, even though the incentive only applies or only would be achievable in fully serviced low-density residential neighborhoods. The application with which council endorsement would be submitted later this week, including a list of 9 initiatives that are outlined within the report. Those are the same initiatives that were presented in Intake 1. This would incentivize approximately 230 additional housing units. With the estimated costs outlined in the report, the funding request, if approved, would exceed $8 million. The report is clearly transparent in noting that if successful in our application, additional staffing resources, particularly within the planning division, would be required to meet these housing projections. And township staff, we're confident in the proposed application towards this intake. And while we're disappointed with the continued classification as large urban, staff contend that the application and objectives outlined within it will help the senior levels of government to achieve their ambitious targets with the support from our small rural community. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Resolution here is moved by Councillor Reid, second by Councillor Martin. The council received for information report FIN 2024-22 regarding second intake of the CMHC Housing Accelerator Fund, Large Urban Stream, and further, the council endorsed the initiatives proposed by staff within the report, and further, that council direct the mayor and clerk and authorize any documents pertaining to the application and submit the complete application on or before September 13th, 2024. Open it up to questions. I will say that if council remembers, after the last intake, I reached out to Minister Fraser's office. Just a couple weeks ago, I did have a conversation with someone from Minister Fraser's office that contacted me after sending a further email. And they have indicated an interest in having discussions with Mapleton. And we're just waiting for them to contact us for discussions about this large urban. As I presented to them, our urban areas are like 3,500 people, not 11,000, and they should be taken into account what our urban area is, not our rural area. And the person I talked to was the Ontario liaison and was quite intrigued with that thought process. So they wanted to loop in other policy people to have the conversation. So we're just waiting for that to happen. Might be a little bit too late for this intake, but it certainly may get them to change their minds further down the road. Questions then from members of council? Seeing none? All in favor? It's carried. Next item up is the budget overview. Patrick, back to you.
Okay, thank you. Heavy agenda with finance items tonight, so I will try to be as brief as possible with this. It's a lot of important information, but I do understand there is some quality viewing on television tonight with a presidential debate in the United States. So I wanted to take a quick opportunity tonight, while the agenda was available, to have a quick overview with some additional context surrounding this year's budget and our multi-year operating and capital forecast. So next slide. I'm going to start with a high-level overview of municipal budgeting, talk about the importance of strategic alignment, go over some guiding principles that staff intend to follow during this year's budget, quick review of some pressures and context. I'd like to speak to the need for a capital prioritization framework moving forward, touch on service level changes, a quick update for community and yourselves on the budget timetable, and then some future considerations. So to begin, what is a municipal budget? Clearly states on here, it's a financial plan that's established by estimating specific costs, revenues, and resources required to meet service level expectations over a specific period of time. Our mission, collectively, as a whole, Mapleton Township staff and council, is to help yourselves, council, make informed decisions on the provision of services and critical capital investments, while continuing to promote stakeholder engagement within the process. Ultimately, you have one duty as council, and that's to determine what the general tax levy requirement is for us to provide the services inclusive of any service level changes, legislative changes, and one-time items. I think that's an important thing to note for lower tier municipalities, that we as staff and council have the ability to determine the general tax levy requirement for the Township of Mapleton. We don't determine the dollars that are on your total tax bill as a property owner within Mapleton. There's contributions to both the county and the school board, which you'll see later on in this slide deck. So the budget is what we refer to as a consolidated budget, so it includes our ongoing operating requirements, so staffing costs being the main driver there, but also maintenance, supplies and materials, as well as our capital budget. That's the funds that we put in to maintain all of the infrastructure assets that Amon so eloquently outlined in her presentation. So we bring those together to develop a consolidated budget and our levy requirement for the year. As with any decision-making processes in the municipality, it's important that we maintain strategic alignment. So when staff are developing budget estimates to include within the proposed budgets, we want to ensure that those requests and requirements align with the strategic plan. I'm not going to go through the strategic plan. Everybody here is well aware of it, and if the community needs to be more advised of it, it's available on our website, but we strive to achieve the overarching goals within it. So an important piece of, you can go to the next slide, sorry, of budgeting and for staff to be more effective in it is to have a set of guiding principles for which we follow consistently across all departments and divisions. Guiding principles usually set out 5 to 10 principles, which provide a concise overview of best practices for the full spectrum of the budget. So while council has not traditionally identified specific guiding principles, we felt it's important in advance of this budget and the budget deliberations to advise you of the principles that we intend to follow as staff. So the 7 high-level guiding principles are that we will continue, as always, to be open and transparent within the budget process. We will engage with the public as much as possible and as feasible. We will remain fiscally responsible in light of any inflationary pressures that are in place. We'll constantly focus, as we did earlier this evening, on ensuring the property tax system is funding the portions they're responsible for, while user pay or growth-related communities are paying for what they would be responsible for. And finally, this township continues to strive for modernization and efficiency. Those help to ensure tax dollars are being used most appropriately. So a budget is a challenge every year, but I would say I feel strongly that we're well positioned to meet that challenge through Mapleton's culture of collaboration, commitment, and trust between both staff and council. We do need to rationalize all expenses that are required to meet the desired service levels of the community. We also need to maximize the use of our existing resources. So sometimes we look to our existing staffing resources, but also technological resources, and make sure we're fully leveraging them to create the most efficiencies and effectiveness across all service areas. And in doing all of that, we continue to be challenged to find the delicate balance between community desires and demands and the resources that we have in place as a township to deliver those expectations. This I can't take credit for, but I think this Venn diagram does an excellent job of explaining the challenge of being municipal staff and a municipal council. So what this outlines is the paradox of municipal budgeting, where it says that if a community wants to have stable services, to have low density, and to have low taxes, unfortunately that community does not exist anywhere. You do need to have a trade-off somewhere. So as you would see, if you'd like to have a low-density community, we would like to have a low-density community, and we want to have low taxes, that means we're going to be cutting services. If we want to have stable services and low taxes, we need a high-density community, high-density housing. And if we want to have stable services and low density, then get ready to pay property taxes, because that's what would be required to do that. I can't take credit for that. That was a presentation I sat on from a gentleman from the city of Calgary about 5 or 6 years ago, but I take it and bring it forward. You'll see that in every budget I present here for many years to come. Key budget, next slide. So key budget pressures for this year specifically. We did look to the inflation rate, the most recent one, which we'll be using in the budget process, which came in at 2.40%. That's the core CPI median measurement. Inflation is decelerating, so we shouldn't expect a big spike in inflationary pressures beyond that. Service level expectations. There's not many communities, I would say, throughout this province or through this country where expectations aren't growing faster than the resources can support. I do come with a number of years of experience in municipalities. I would say that this is one of the most lean staffing models I've seen in my history of doing my role as a CFO. Having said that, the output from the team here is amazing. That'll become more challenging, a lean staffing model, as this community does see growth coming on through a number of initiatives mentioned in recent meetings. External government funding, we've talked about that, but a lot of reliance on application-based programs makes it difficult to predict our needs within the budget from our own tax base. A great example is the Housing Enabling Water Systems funding, which we were very confident we would be successful in receiving. We were not successful in that. That makes it challenging because we go back to the drawing board as far as how to fund a lot of that core infrastructure, water, wastewater, roads, bridges that are required for the impending growth. And then finally, I don't need to talk about an infrastructure deficit because we went through that earlier this evening. So some additional context as we head into the budget season. This next slide does show the annual tax levy trend. So the two blue columns have been approved, are already in place, 2023 and 2024. The last three columns are within the multi-year budget forecast. 2025, which the forecast assumed a 3.55% increase in 2025. That would generate, as you can see, just over $10 million in total levy funding to the municipality, and then moving forward in 26 and 27. The next slide, though, I think is more beneficial to council to understand. There's a lot of talk in municipalities about the percentage levy increase, the percentage. What's your percentage increase? Percentage is a great number for newspapers, but it doesn't tell the whole story. This one does. A 1% tax levy increase here in Mapleton Township would generate less than $100,000. If you went to the city of Toronto, or even take one of the cities around Toronto, Mississauga and Brampton, a 1% tax levy increase generates millions and millions of additional funding. I like to focus on what the impact is to the average residential property taxpayer from a dollar perspective rather than a percentage, because it can be misleading. But this helps you to understand going into the budget, if there were to be any adjustments by council directed to staff, that's the adjustment it would be making. So a 25 basis point adjustment would really save about $22,000 to the property tax base. Next slide, Maggie. This slide tells the story of the historical property taxes within Mapleton. I'll preface by saying these are the Mapleton property taxes, not property taxes that are going to the county or the school boards. This is the proportion of your residential tax bill that is going to Mapleton services. This is based on an average assessment of $363,000, but as you can see, from 2016 to 2024, the pink shaded area is what the actual approved budget was. So the average property taxpayer went from paying, approximately $1,600 to around $1,750 over that time period in property taxes to Mapleton. If we had followed inflation, just an inflationary adjustment every year over that same time period, they would be paying approximately $220 additional in taxes. That equates to $732,000 in additional funding that my colleagues within the room would have available to close some of those funding gaps and pressures that we have just by following inflation and inflation alone. But if you look at it holistically over that time period, the average annual increase to residential property taxes in Mapleton Township was 1.19% over that time period. And I would challenge council and anyone to find any service or product that over the same time period only increased by an average of 1.19% annually and still has the quality and reliability of services that are provided to the community here in Mapleton. It's quite admirable that Mapleton can provide what we do for the community with levy increases held to that small of an amount annually. I think that's enough on that slide, and we'll go to the next one. So a challenge in municipal budgeting is when you don't have assessment growth. You can only rely on levy increases. Assessment growth isn't going to help you to add the additional funds to meet the service level requirements of the community. And service level requirements are defined by the community. They're not something that staff come and decide is a service level requirement. This is what the community desires to have in Mapleton. Assessment growth, in the good years, you can see on that graph, can help us out greatly, 10-12%. But in the lean years, in the slower development years, when we're hamstrung by obstacles in our way, like capacity issues, assessment growth is very low, and that's where we're at right now in Mapleton heading into this budget year. Next slide, gets to that property tax distribution. So for your tax residential property tax bill. For every dollar that's provided, 36 cents is used within Mapleton Township towards Mapleton services delivery. 49 cents goes to the County of Wellington for the services provided there, and the remaining 15 cents is allocated to the school boards. The next graph on the other side shows how we utilize those funds that Mapleton collects. So 48 cents of the funding goes towards ongoing operations, 46 cents goes to capital and reserves, and 6 cents goes to servicing debt. The next slide, and I like that Councillor Martin noted my predecessor, Mr. Morrison's financial indicators and financial strategy. This is derived directly from the BMA study. It's a good comparator to show where Mapleton sits in relation to our provincial peers. So average income in Mapleton on average is higher per household than the rest of the province. Our assessment per capita in Mapleton is lower than the rest of the province on average. I would say our financial position per capita is stronger than the rest of the province. I would say that's a result of prudent fiscal management within this municipality, good capital planning, using and leveraging debt where necessary, but not taking on debt for items that are not critical. The net levy per $100,000 of assessment, so that's the total taxes payable. That's Mapleton County and school boards per 100,000 of assessment. On average, we're paying $3 more than the entire province of Ontario average in Mapleton, $3 more. And the final one I think is excellent, own source revenues. So this is a measure of how much of our ongoing operations and capital are funded by sources of revenues that we generate internally. So 96%, well above the provincial average of 90%. We source those funds through our own property taxes, our own user rates, and don't rely heavily on external funding programs. That underscores the benefit of those external funding programs. If we can access those funds, it's only going to help what we can do because we're already funding 96% of our total costs from our own tax base. Next slides talk about a capital prioritization framework. This is something we're going to work towards. You won't see it as much in this year's budget because, well, just in the instance of time. But it's a model that helps us to prioritize which capital initiatives and assist you as council in determining which capital initiatives should be a priority over other ones. Obviously, with every department and division, their projects are the biggest priority, but we need a way collectively as a group to determine what should go forward when we have limited funding resources. So a capital prioritization framework would rely on master plans, condition assessments, regulatory requirements. We'd prioritize based on risk, timing, and cost using a lot of the asset management framework that's already in place. And we would move that into our capital plans and budget. So the next slide just talks about some of the measures we would use and weigh. So projects would be looked at based on each of these measurements. We would work with council to determine what's the appropriate weight to apply to each of these measures. We would score all of them to decide which projects are the priorities, both for our own capital program and priorities for putting forward for external funding as well. The next slide just talks about next steps. You can read that. I don't need to read it to you, but we'll review what's working well, what isn't, and what we should be doing moving forward. Budget engagement, as we said, public engagement is an important part of a budget process. Public input session will be held November 18th is the date to mark in your calendars. It's going to be on the next slide as well. That's being held at the PMD Arena, a chance for the public to give input with all staff or certain staff and council present to hear from it. But again, I'll just note that that's not the one and only time the public can engage in the budget process. I'm sure day to day, you as councillors, we as staff hear from the public on what our priorities, what our needs. That input needs to come into the budget process as well, not strictly what we hear that one night that's set aside for an engagement session. With regards to service levels, not a great deal of service level expansions from a staffing level considered within this budget. It will annualize the costs of the finance department restructuring. There are minor adjustments to student staffing hours that are going to be proposed. But a key element is for us as staff to focus on future staffing plans for this organization. You've heard report after report about impending growth once capacity is in place and this community growing. We need collectively, through the leadership of our CAO, to have a plan in place and present it to you as council as far as what our requirements are going to be going forward, so we can prepare for that. Non-staffing service level expansions are important. So this is when council or the community comes forward with expectations that we don't currently fulfill. Those come at a cost if we choose to move forward with them, and those will be outlined explicitly and transparently within the budget so that council is aware there is a cost to new service levels or new expectations in the community. So the next slide, I'm going to wrap up here. The timeline, as presented here, it's available on the website now within this report. But ultimately, we're kicking off tonight with a high-level overview, kind of setting the stage for our budget. We're working already internally, like I said, meeting started last week already, internally going through some budget estimates. Ultimately, we hope to come forward October 22nd would be the council meeting, and that council meeting is when I would want plan to table the budget. The formal tabling the budget is a process a lot of municipalities use whereby the budget would be presented that evening, formally tabled. The expectation that evening isn't for deliberations or debate on the budget. It's more to put it out there for council and the community to consume. There's additional dates following that, the workshop with council, some of the session, public input session. That's where some of the deliberations and debate would come from. Ultimately, still targeting to have the budget approved by council by December 10th or before the end of the year. The last piece I'll talk about is future considerations, so you know what's on the horizon. Again, Mr. Morrison left this place from a financial standpoint in a great spot. His long-term financial planning strategy is something that communities across the province follow and have used. I actually, in a previous municipality, utilized John's framework to develop a long-term integrated financial strategy for another community. So you can go to the next slide, Maggie. So that strategy more or less expands upon what John put in place. Sorry, I shouldn't refer to him as John, Mr. Morrison, I'm sorry. That strategy was put in place in 2019. It's due for a review and update, and we would seek as staff to review and update that with the input of council to have a new refreshed long-term integrated financial strategy going forward. And I think I got that done in adequate time, but happy to take any questions from council that you may have.
All right, we'll open up the questions for Mr. Kelly. Great report, sir. Really appreciate the overview. Questions from council? All right, thank you very much. Oh, okay, question, comment, then, go ahead.
Just a comment, you talked about that Venn diagram, but I even wrote that down. I think we all need that on a T-shirt whenever we're out in public. Just to always have it. When they ask questions, you're like, this is it. This is what, because that's exactly the message that we've gotten before. You know, you can do it good, you can do it cheap, you can do it quick. Pick two, right? And that's kind of what you.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And the pick two is bang on. You can't do them all, and everybody wants all of them. So it does put council in a very difficult position. If you did get T-shirts made up, I would ask you to put a trademark on them for the gentleman that made that diagram. So we're not dealing with anything there, but thank you.
We'll ask permission first. Councilor Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you for this report. I do think the challenging part in all budget kind of conversations is the communication to the public, right? Like, I think the levy impact is probably, you know, the fairest number to use. But I do think that you had mentioned, you know, the actual dollar value per 100,000 of your assessment is something that people can kind of relate to their own situation, right? Like, you're probably hard pressed to find a house appraised at 300,000 in Mapleton, but you can take your own kind of appraisal and reflect it on yourself, right? Like, what we don't want and what we've had in the past is, you know, potentially like a negative tax rate And the reality is, with assessment growths and impact assessment, someone's taxes are still going up. So we can trumpet this negative, your tax rate's going down. Well, in reality, your property taxes are still going up, right? So for me, that's like a complete miscommunication. And then the last part is I do struggle a little bit with the concept that any sort of assessment growth is kind of like the townships to do with what they will, right? At the end of the day, the tax rate plus the impact assessment equals what your cost is per property, right? So it's kind of that big number at the end that's the important one, because we can play with the other numbers, or somebody plays with the impact, we play with the tax rate to get to where we need, right? So I think the communication piece is absolutely the key to, informing Mapleton residents of where we're going, right? And it's, I think you had mentioned like a 1.19 kind of tax rate adjustment over the past bunch of years, but our levy, I promise you, has gone up way more than 1.19%, right? So it's really, for me, it's tricky to really kind of communicate, and I think you did a good job in this report tonight, so thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. A few pieces in there, which is helpful to explain. You're right, appraisals of properties nowhere in the $300,000 to $360,000 range. Assessment of properties within the $300,000 to $360,000 range. That's a key distinction that members of the community need to hear, that your assessment value and the appraisal value of your house are two drastically different things. To your other point on the levy, that isn't in fact true. The property tax levy, the total dollar levy amount on average from 2016 until 2024 has increased by 1.19% per year on average. It's when you spread it out over that time period, what's being collected for, and this is for Mapleton specifically, has not grown substantially. And you referenced in there was those years of negative. Those are in there, and that makes a big difference. But ultimately, we want to look at a stable, sustainable budget for the community. To your point about communication, very happy to communicate with the public and outline key pieces of the budget at any point in time. If you as council have input into how presentations such as this one, when they go to the community, maybe at the input session, can be strengthened to add more context that would be helpful to your constituents, I'm happy to hear it and happy to embed that in any presentation, because ultimately this is our budget collectively, staff, council, and the entire community, and we should all play a part in it. So thanks.
Thank you, and I know you said it a few times tonight, Mapleton's versus county versus school board, and that is one of the key things that a lot of people in the community, when they get their tax bill, they lump everything to Mapleton. And we have to keep telling people over and over again, like you told us tonight, separate it out. We're 36 cents of every dollar, not $1 of every dollar. Other questions or comments? Did I read this yet, Mr. Clerk? No. Okay, let me read this. Moved by Councilor Martin, second by Councilor Reed, that Township Mapleton Council receive for information Finance Report FIN 2024-23 regarding a pre-budget overview and direction, and the staff be directed to compile the draft 2025 municipal budget based on a levy adjustment of 3.55% as per the existing multi-year budget forecast. Any other questions or comments? All in favor? That's carried. Thank you, Patrick. You no longer need it for the next report. I know you've had like four or five there. Next, we have a consent application. Moved by Councilor Reed, second by Councilor Martin, that Council, the Township Mapleton, support consent application B69/24 as presented for lands described as Lot 16, Concession 6, with the conditions, the usual conditions. And further, that council authorize the Planning and Development Manager to file with the Secretary Treasurer of the Planning and Land Division Committee at the County of Wellington a letter of clearance of these conditions of the same, completion of the same. Questions or comments to Michelle or Linda? Nothing. All in favor? That's carried. Next, we have moved by Councillor Martin, second by Councillor Reed, that the Township of Mapleton Council receive for information Public Works Report, PW 2024-17, dated September 10th, 2024, with respect to the 2024 Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks Inspection Report, the Moorfield Well Supply, and that council acknowledge receipt of the inspection report to satisfy legislative requirements. Mr. Morgan, do you have any comments on that?
To Mayor Davidson Council. This will be similar to the Drayton Water report that came from the MECP. It'll be, if accepted by council, it'll be posted on the Township of Mapleton website.
Questions on this report to Mr. Morgan? Then I'll call the question. All in favor? That's carried. Item number 10, we have approval of bylaws. Moved by Councillor Martin, second by Councillor Reed, that bylaw number 2024-044, being a bylaw to amend zoning bylaw 2010-080, being a zoning bylaw for the Township of Mapleton, be hereby read a first, second, and third time. Finally passed this 10th day of September 2024. All in favor? That's carried. We have correspondence there for council's information, which is the Maitland Conservation Report. I do have a resolution here on this, as the report did suggest that they will come and visit us if we ask them to. So this resolution, moved by Councillor Tamlin, second by Councillor Ottens, the Township of Mapleton Council direct the clerk to invite Phil Beard, NVCA, to delegate at our next meeting of council regarding a presentation on the draft watershed strategy and the 2024 to 2026 work plan. Any questions on that? All in favor? It's carried. We do have the item 12, correspondence for council's information. Anybody need a comment on that? Any notices of motion tonight? Not seeing any notices of motion. Go to item number 15, which is other business. Go ahead. Okay, Councillor Ottens.
Back in the spring, we had talked about a John Ford Citizen of the Year award, that we would look into that once the senior was done, and since that's done, I just wonder what's the follow-up on that?
Yes, that has conversations were going to take place with John Ford's sister, who needed time and has just reached out again today. So then we'll have some more conversations going forward. Councillor Reed, you had something?
Through you, Mayor, I'm just wondering, well, I have two things. First is I just wanted to thank everyone for their support when I went to AMO. It was really a great conference. I unfortunately did not get the Rule Caucus position, but have been invited to a committee or two with the Roma board. I'm just waiting to hear what that's going to look like. But I appreciated all the support. It was a good experience, met a lot of people. And of the actual voting, we actually had the highest turnout for votes that they've ever seen. So I just thought that was really interesting. We had 79% of people who were registered to vote and able to do so. That did. The second thing I'm wondering is, not sure who to direct it to, probably yourself. I see other local county councils like ourselves that get updates about what's going on at the county level during a municipal meeting. So things like changes to solid waste that are coming up, changes to roads and bridges that are county roads. And being we have such a lot of those things in our community, I'm wondering if we're able to have a report either from yourself, maybe monthly, just to say if there's anything that we need to know. If maybe it's nothing, maybe there's nothing changing, but if those big key things to know at this level. I mean, I go in and I read them and I watch them, but I think sometimes it would be pertinent for the residents to hear it through these sessions.
Okay. I know that often Councillor Campbell comes out, and we can continue to invite him, but I have no problem doing this. If council would like to do it on a monthly basis, I can certainly follow up on a monthly basis as well and give you updates.
Awesome, thank you.
That's something I can add into the other business in the future, Mr. Clerk. Sure. All right. Anything further on other business? All right, then we have the no closed session tonight. We have the confirmatory bylaw and resolution. Yeah, Mr. Barron's just bringing up what we had here on the senior, on Mr. Chow, was a nomination for the Ontario Senior Achievement Award, an invitation to submit. So if council has ideas to submit a name, that we can do so prior to the nomination deadline. Which is October 1st. So we can do that next meeting. So the resolution here, on the last confirmatory bylaw, moved by Councillor Reid, second by Councillor Martin, that bylaw number 2024-045, being a bylaw to confirm all actions and proceedings of the council of the corporation of Township of Maple to be hereby read a first, second, and third time, signed by the mayor and clerk, sealed with a corporate seal. All in favor? Thank you, that's carried. We are now adjourned.